Welcome to the Sainsbury Wellcome Center for the fourth Sainsbury Wellcome Center lecture. This lecture series was established to engage our minds, us as neuroscientists, into topics that are outside of the normal realm of neuroscience. So for the first lecture, we had David Attenborough, who spoke about the perception of beauty in birds. In the second lecture, Franz de Waal gave us kind of good evidence that humans are not the only species that exhibits empathy and kindness towards others. For the third lecture, Daniel Dennett, a kind of neuroscience philosopher, told us about the materialistic basis of the mind. And today, in our fourth lecture, we have Professor Emily Murphy, who will tell us, well, about the intersection between behavioral and neurosciences and law and policymaking, which is a topic that probably most of us don't ever think about, but it's a super important topic in terms of how we shape society going forward. Briefly about Emily. So Emily is a professor at the law at the University of California Hastings College of Law in San Francisco, and she teaches generally about law and also brain and behavioral sciences there, and in particular about the impact of law in society and policy making, as we'll hear more today. Now, Emily has a very unusual trajectory, and maybe a trajectory that might inspire some of you. So she studied, her undergraduate was at Harvard University. She studied psychology and brain-mind behavior. And then she did a PhD at Cambridge, at Trinity College, kind of working further in cognitive sciences. And then, as I just heard, Emily developed a rat allergy, so she couldn't pursue a kind of career in kind of systems, neuroscience, imaging, recording brain activity research. So she thought of kind of what careers would be suitable for her. So then she did a postdoc at the Stanford Law School Center for Law and Biosciences, and also a part of the MacArthur Foundation's Law and Neuroscience Project. And this kind of shifted the mind and opened the mind to the possibility of studying, law in the context of behavioral neuroscience. And I think, she clerked with the Honorable Richard Pace at the U.S. Court of Appeals in the Ninth Circuit, which is kind of a very prestigious thing to do if you want to become a lawyer. And then she obtained her final law qualification from Stanford Law School, and then practiced law commercially for a little bit and did some really important pro bono work before decided to return to academia, which was always a job, to study this intersection. Now, I think, okay, so without further ado, Emily is known for trying to understand how much of neuroscience and neuroscience methods we can use in the court of law. Specifically, testimonies of individuals are very important. And if we can read their brain activity, how much can we use that to make an assessment about whether they're lying or telling the truth? And what is the evidence for that? And so that's what she's very well known for. But recently, her research has shifted about thinking about how behavioral sciences can really shape policy and lawmaking, such that it can further enhance what she calls the collective cognitive capital. And this is really important in terms of how we shape our future in society. So without further ado, please welcome Emily Murphy.
Thank you so much for having me. I've been looking forward to this for quite some time, delayed a bit by pandemic, but this is a real treat and pleasure to get to talk to scientists who are down in the trenches and invite you to join me in thinking about what is the point of doing this work in terms of the broader societal impact. So I want to share with you I think, simple but rather radical idea that I am calling collective cognitive capital. And that idea is that is good for human flourishing when our brains work well and together. This is perhaps blindingly obvious, but not how we think about governance. I think, and here's the central claim of the talk, that we should be using brain and behavioral science to evaluate the decisions about how we govern ourselves, and really to achieve what government is ideally meant to do, which is, at least in the United States, promote the general welfare. We can, it's going to be hard, but we can, and I think we should, use brain and behavioral science to evaluate choices about law and public policy decisions by how it has impact on the brain and behavioral functioning, the collective cognitive capital of the populace. So I'm going to lay out this concept, and then I want to, this is an early stage research project. It's very conceptual at this point, and I want to invite you, especially as a scientist, to help join me in its development, because it's going to require large consortium type interdisciplinary work to bring to fruition. Before we get to it, I want to do just a little bit of table setting because I know this is not a common neuroscience and society topic about kind of the two interdisciplinary fields that have come before, because I think this represents a major shift in the work that's being done in neuroscience and society. And the first one is what we call like law and neuroscience 1.0. And the other one is behavioral public policy or behavioral economics, which you may be more familiar with. The UK government is quite fond of this. So, but first with law and neuroscience, where much of my prior work has been. Law and neuroscience has, when it started in the early aughts, kind of began by posing the question, if we could perfectly predict human behavior, what result for law? And this started for me in a class at the end of my undergraduate career, taught jointly with the law school, that literally started by showing us the movie Minority Report and letting us run with it from there. Law and neuroscience, as it started, was focused very much in the realm of criminal law. It's where most philosophers' minds went. It's where a lot of philosophers are still spending their time. Do we have free will? If we do, great. If we don't, can we punish people the way that we currently do? I don't think these questions are the really important ones, and I'll tell you why. But just for a little bit of context, there was a very influential, but I think entirely incorrect paper, two papers really written in 2004 by some very prominent neuroscientists that claimed, for example, that questions in the criminal law will, quote, lose their grip in an age when the mechanical nature of human decision-making is fully appreciated, and therefore we shouldn't punish people retributively. Law is not going to do this. It's not actually core to criminal law, and it's never, I think, going to get political or public buy-in. Robert Sapolsky, though, also argued that neuroscience would lead to a complete reformation of the criminal law because people who committed criminal acts were more like cars with broken brakes than people who should be moralized and need a kind of fixing rather than judgment. Again, this has not been uptaken in the criminal law. The criminal law does not, this I think represents a misunderstanding of what criminal law is based on. Free will is an interesting and important question, but one that is largely set aside from the day-to-day practice of law. It's just not as critical. So that's law and neuroscience kind of 1.0, at least the big questions in it. There's also behavioral public policy, kind of the outgrowth of behavioral economics or law and behavioral economics, which has followed on from classical law and economics, where law has, at least the models in law, assumed that humans act rationally. Well, behavioral economics tells us humans don't act rationally. They have all kinds of heuristics and biases. Let's revise our assumptions and the powerful assumptions, at least in private law in the United States, that people don't act rationally. What should we do instead? Well, this has been popular in many ways, including quite conspicuously in the UK government, but also in the United States. Your nudge unit, which I understand is now a private corporation, did stuff. It had some impact. I think some modest impact that this policymaking via nudging is fundamentally founded on a normative principle called libertarian paternalism. The idea that we can get individuals to make decisions that are better for them, but they're still fundamentally free to choose as they will. We're not going to mandate them to do things. We're going to set up environments and architectures so they make better choices. But note that there's still a judgment element of what those better choices are. So behavioral economics has been influential, but I think has taken a really narrow view of what behavioral science actually is. And the research questions about heuristics and biases in decision-making make up quite a narrow slice of all the type of work that brain and behavioral scientists do. So there's a lot more science to be made use of. But also critically, I think that behavioral economics, behavioral public policy has taken a very uncritical view of governance as we find it. It has adopted and incorporated principles of market fundamentalism, individualism, what we might call neoliberalism. That the neoliberal state, this is how it works. How do we get people to be better behaving citizens within the state? How do we get them to pay their taxes on time? How do we get them to put insulation in their attics? nudgy type small decisions. In the United States, the biggest splash of behavioral law and economics has been mandating, or sorry, nudging, not mandating, nudging that when you join a workforce, your retirement contributions are sort of automatically set to a default rather than having to opt in. This is good, right? It helps people save for retirement. This is good. It's done so in the absence of questioning whether or not that's a better system than a more robust social safety network for retirees or pensioners, or a private pension system, defined benefit plans. But let's get people to work better within the system as it is. This has been the project of behavioral economics and behavioral public policy. The focus really being, and this is, I hope you sense a critical tone here, on manipulating individuals' behavior towards a means, towards particular ends that are already defined by the state. I think we can do better than this. And I think we can use brain and behavioral science to do better than this and to demand better of our project of collective self-governance in democratic society. Arguably, not only is I think this a political project, I think this is fundamentally why you're doing the research that you do. What is the point of trying to deeply understand how the human brain works and how behavior arises as it does? Is it to better, I mean, there's inherent scientific interest, right? You don't have to tell me. These questions are inherently, intrinsically interesting. But why do we spend lots of public money doing this? Why do we dedicate entire lives, entire careers to these questions, especially when we feel like we're making tiny drops of knowledge into the scientific bucket? I think underneath it all is this idea that better understanding leads to a better human experience. Well, I think we can start to push the science into an aggregating model that can push government to do better by us. And that's what this project is really about. I fundamentally view both law and separately brain and behavioral science both deal with human behavior. There have to be points of contact that I think are broader and deeper than individual adjudication of criminals or whether or not we can use brain scans in court. I think these questions touch our lives in a much broader sense. And the legal entrance into this is going to sound very boring. It's what's called administrative law, at least in the United States. And you're like, oh no, she's going to put me to sleep now. When I came to law school as a scientist, and I thought, administrative law, filling out forms, it's going to be tedious and boring. It is probably the most important way of understanding how our society works. So administrative law in the United States, I'm not clear on whether there's an analog here, is the law about how the regulatory agencies that carry out the day-to-day effectuation of laws and policies that elected officials put into place. They're nominally executive branches, and I believe you have analogies here of semi-autonomous agencies, such as executive agencies and NDPBs. But in the United States, administrative law governs, as well as here, I think governs everything from consumer safety, vehicle emissions, vehicle safety standards, food and medicine safety, paying taxes, labor policy, environmental protection, business regulation, agriculture, education policy, healthcare, housing, everything. This is our day-to-day life. This is how it works. And understanding how administrative law works was like pulling back the curtain on, oh, this is what governance really does. Things we mostly don't think about. And that's actually great, right? It means we live in a, generally speaking, functioning society. This is about to change in the United States. I think in about 2 hours' time, we're going to get one of our last Supreme Court decisions that might completely gut the ability of administrative agencies to make these decisions. It's in the United States, at least, a politically controversial project because administrative agencies are not discussed in the United States Constitution, whereas Congress quite clearly is. So there's questions about power and questions about control and who gets to decide. But for now, and I think because these things are going to be actually very hard to undo, these types of agencies endure. And so how can we bring brain and behavioral science to bear? How can we make them look through the lens of brain and behavioral science to say which policies, which procedures, which ways of getting life done promote and enhance the collective cognitive capital of the people? So that's where this project is. Collective cognitive capital is, I want to be very clear, at present, what I would term a naming and framing project. I don't have all the answers yet. I would love to discuss many of the open questions further with you in discussion and in further conversation. But today, the task is to explain generally what I think it is, how I think it's going to work, and then what I think it requires, both from law and policymakers, but also from you, from neuroscience researchers, from funders, about how to design this type of work. But naming and framing is an important first step, even though you might leave here feeling a little bit unsatisfied. Maybe this is a little too conceptual. We're still working on nailing down the nuts and bolts. But naming and framing is really important for political success. And so you'll forgive some of the kind of marketing element of the alliterative title, collective cognitive capital. Fundamentally, as I said at the beginning, it's a way of thinking about brain health and brain functions as an aggregated resource, as capital. It's a conceptual framework for synthesizing brain and behavioral science data from a lot of different domains. This isn't going to be dominated by cognitive neuroscience. It isn't going to be dominated by sociology. It's going to be a way of bringing all that type of information together into a broader conceptual framework. And again, the core thesis is simple. We can and we should use brain and behavioral science to evaluate public policy by how it affects the cognitive and emotional functioning of the people. And that normatively speaking, policy should seek to maximize collective cognitive capital because it is inherently valuable. I would argue it's inherently what makes us human and what makes us a society and what makes us work well and work together. It also maximizes, I think, other things that we value, like agency and freedom. And again, in contrast to behavioral economics or law and behavioral economics, the target is the policy or the rule or the procedure or the institution itself, not the individual. So let's take each term in reverse. We'll start with capital. I am deliberately using the language of capital. It's a metaphor. It's imperfect. All metaphors are. But I think the use of the term capital is particularly important here and for brain and behavioral science interdisciplinary work to embrace, because by speaking the language of capital, we're starting to speak the language of policy and of law. This is because it's been well demonstrated by others, law creates capital. It identifies assets. This is what law does. It creates, it recognizes, it protects, and in our systems, it prioritizes capital. It codes resources as capital, and thus, in the form of at least wealth and resources, capital both directly and indirectly dominates legal and economic analysis. It is the water that legal and economic analyses in, I think, especially post-Reagan, post-Thatcher, that we swim in. It's just assumed, it's the background. So we need to speak that language. But the metaphor helps because it has some descriptively accurate elements as well. Capital conveys that the resource we're talking about requires investment to maximize productivity. It's capable of growth, subject to fluctuations in response to the surrounding conditions, and harmed by underinvestment or withdrawals here, such as stress, trauma, neglect, malnutrition, all kinds of things. This metaphor has been extended. Probably familiar with human capital, cultural capital, social capital. Ecological economists have a concept called natural capital that I think is a useful analogy to think about here. Fisher people might think of boats and nets. Those are obviously, economists can obviously identify those things as capital, right? Those are objects that are used to create productive work. But fish in the sea are also an essential input that's used again and again in production. And if all the fish were depleted, if you were to destroy the capital, the natural capital of fish, no more production. I think cognitive capital can be thought of analogously. It's not a fixed capacity. It is depleted off and on. It is renewable. There are both acute, I think, attentional bandwidth versions, as well as broader systemic versions of development, of education, of resilience in the face of aging, resilience in the face of pathologies or insults. So it has a lot of features that feel like capital. Let's talk about cognitive. It means something broader in this context than I think what most people in this room understand cognitive as. And again, forgive me for the alliterative collective cognitive capital. I use cognitive in a broader sense as something like derived from brain states, which you're like, yes, everything is derived from brain states. But it's meant to encompass what are termed by some researchers as non-cognitive features, as well emotional and social regulatory abilities, not the kind of narrow functional components of perception, attention, executive function that we might think of as the units of study in cognitive and behavioral neuroscience, or even more discrete than those units. The actual content of the way, at least this first version of collective cognitive capital it tries to incorporate research in a squishy, loose meta-analysis from what I've currently identified as 4 domains. And those are brain development and plasticity, general intelligence and fluid reasoning, cognitive control, probably the broadest domain, including attentional control, inhibitory control, social and emotional regulatory abilities. And the 4th broad domain would be cognitive reserve. So resilience in the face of neuropathology and normal aging. Broadly speaking, and I'll go into each of those in a little bit more detail, but broadly speaking, cognitive here means something like perceiving, thinking, feeling, deciding, acting, and the means to do so. This is a means-based concept, not an ends-based concept. This is a means-based concept. This is how we function in our lives. This is something we value and is very important. Let's talk briefly about collective before going back to think about what goes into this cognitive component, because that's where your expertise is going to come in, right? Collective is an important emphasis in this project because it emphasizes that while brain and behavioral data is necessarily collected from individuals, and that something like cognitive capital certainly exists at the level of an individual, the type of concerns we have about normal, subtle, everyday behaviors require massive amounts of group data. We are interested in talking about pathology and clinical conditions on the extreme, but we're also talking about the normal human day-to-day experience, not just those people who need our treatment in clinical context, although them as well. But we need group-based data. This is population-level neuroscience. This is the epidemiological focus that's starting to get a lot more attention as capacity for data analysis and data collection becomes bigger and broader. It's also very important to keep this concept collective for 2 other reasons. One, the concept of collective captures, I think, an important relational property, the relational nature of cognition in society, communication, relationships, these types of things that should be supported and valued, and that themselves create value. And they're probably the most important things in the world to us, are the cognitive capacities we share with each other. That is to say, I think that the concept of the collective is more important as a resource than just a sort of individual sum of parts. So some welfare functions, like well-being measures, think if we just sum over all the people, the general well-being, we'll get kind of a utilitarian function of how we need to evaluate things. I think this captures both the individual's kind of summation of individual capacity, but also that there's something inherently relational about the capacities we're interested in. The other reason is that for the necessary focus on collective is that collective outcomes are the coin of the realm in policy analysis. We don't make policies to affect discrete individuals, although maybe we're thinking about a particular type of individual that a policy is trying to incentivize or get to change their behavior. But decision makers have to act on behalf of the collective, the best available information. So we should think about this collective cognitive capital as a collective property if we want policymakers to think about how are we maximizing and promoting the collective cognitive capital of the demos or the populace. So that's what it is. how would this work? Right? This is a difficult, big concept. It invites a lot of scientists to the table. It invites economists. It needs political theorists. I can't do this on my own. I need many fellow travelers. So let's think about a little bit about, here's what I thought so far, at least about how would this work. I think it's possible, I think it's possible, but maybe not desirable to create something like an index or an indicator. The World Bank uses the Human Capital Index, which is made up of just a few kind of but easily measurable variables to assess development across different economies. It takes a lot of very complicated things and simplifies them down to one particular number. I'm not sure we can do that with this or that it would be desirable, but maybe there is something like a complex, a statistical model. I don't actually know exactly what this would look like yet, but that's the next phase of the project that I'm working on. But let's talk about the scientific components that go into it. I said there were 4 areas. I actually divide them or group them further into 2 kind of domains, which might bother you, but for kind of purposes of talking to law and policy makers, I think of as like the biological and the functional, only in terms of how we might assess or make measurements. Are these behavioral measurements on the functional side? Are these biological measurements on the, for example, the development or neuroplasticity side? So on the biological domain, development, plasticity, and reserve and resilience. Maybe at the beginning of life, in the end of life, but also throughout the middle. How do brains change? How do they stay resilient? How do they create networks? These can be kind of the biological questions. And we have some data on these, of course, but we also have a lot more theory, I think, right now than clear mechanistic data about how such systems develop and how they stay resilient in the face of aging. I think this is hard to operationalize right now in the early years, especially like resilience theory has been through a number of waves of research, and we're still working on it in part because it's very difficult to do this kind of work in human beings, right? I don't have to explain to you why, but this is challenging work to do in human beings. So theory might be where we are right now. But that said, development, plasticity, and brain resilience is, I think, even though difficult to operationalize, very important for this theory because it's what promotes hope for better futures. It promotes optimism, and in contrast to the idea that I don't think anybody here would come in with, but policymakers or people naive to brain and behavioral science might have that brain-based means hardwired. Those things are not equivalent, they're not true, you all know that. But work on resilience and interventions supports theories of neurological recovery from trauma, adversity, low socioeconomic status. Maybe we don't know how much, maybe we don't know maximal capacities of any given person, but this is an important component such that the concept does not become misused. Let's talk briefly about the functional categories. So the general intelligence, fluid reasoning, and cognitive, emotional, and social regulatory functions. I have a longer paper on this that has a lot more of the data and examples than I have time to get into here today. But again, I want to emphasize that what this concept is interested in are subtle, normal, and social behaviors, not exclusively diagnostic constructs or extreme sort of clinical ends of the spectrum. So again, group data is needed to find, large group data is needed to find small effect sizes. But this is an area where, because we can do human experiments with cognitive functioning, interventions and experiments to determine causality are a much stronger possibility, and that is indeed the domain and the interest of researchers, included here, I'm sure, but everywhere else as well. And importantly, I think to the first pass of how this might play out politically are the data showing that aspects of cognitive functioning, that these are dynamic and that they're sensitive to what is variously described as cognitive load, cognitive burdens, cognitive costs, administrative taxes or cognitive bandwidth, and that these types of burdens seem to particularly affect executive functioning. We have especially attention and inhibitory control. We get observable effects on judgment and decision making. We're seeing emerging data coalescing around ideas that this is perhaps how some of the psychology of low socioeconomic status works, is that the status itself, the environmental conditions, impinge upon the cognitive capacities of the people acutely in those conditions, who have less attentional bandwidth, have greater pressures on decision-making, that and diminishment of the ability to spend attentional bandwidth in other areas, social functioning, relationships, self-care, all these types of things. If we conceptualize these administrative burdens as cognitive taxes and bandwidth, and think about how the government should be alleviating those, I think that data takes on new resonance and new salience. I think that the interdependence of the cognitive and non-cognitive abilities, again, you're probably wanting to fight me on the definition of cognitive as used here, and I don't blame you at all. But the cognitive and non-cognitive skills reciprocally facilitate accumulation of the other and important to the development of broader health capabilities. Note on that, this framework has a lot of touch points with what are called social determinants of health research, which is at least extremely popular right now in the United States, or growing in popularity, at least in circles that I run in. Why is this not just social determinants of health? I think much of it is, but understanding that ill health also has cognitively burdensome effects. The need to manage your appointments, the need to, at least in the United States, navigate our monstrous healthcare system and our insurance system are huge cognitive taxes. Setting aside just the cognitive burdens and well-being, mental health well-being burdens of ill health generally. So this relates closely to, but is not, I think, is broader than social determinants of health more generally. So, okay, Emily, can we put all of these things into a single indicator or index? I think we might not even want to, but this is a question I'm exploring next with people who know a lot more about how to do that and the risks and drawbacks. But an alternative approach might exist in kind of a consensus expert decision-making type of consortium. Does that sound like command and control governance? Maybe, but it was a model like that was proposed by Supreme Court Justice before he was a Supreme Court Justice, Stephen Breyer, who is retiring in 2 hours as well. That getting together experts, and I imagine maybe perhaps a consortium of rotating experts somewhat insulated from political processes, including economists as well, make concessions to economists, including brain and behavioral scientists from across the spectrum to be kind of doing a kind of dynamic meta-analysis to analyze policies and procedures and think, how is this going to affect the cognitive burdens of the people affected by this decision? How is this going to promote cognitive beneficial brain development? How is this going to help protect against, how is this going to preserve resilience, brain resilience in the face of pathology and aging and insults? What is the effect on the collective cognitive capital of the people of this particular policy, of this environmental pollutant, of this, and not in terms of numbers, not just in terms, I view this as an alternative perhaps, or a supplement to cost benefit analysis, which is, since capital is the coin of the realm and economic efficiency is the water that law and policy experts swim in, everything needs to be reduced to numbers. But this is an imperfect, highly criticized system, especially when it comes to assessing benefits. I think that assessing things in terms of the effect of collective cognitive capital of the populace provides a more holistic, more nuanced, less dehumanizing element of decision-making. So what does this require from law and policymakers? What does it require from scientists? Again, I think this is analogous or an alternative assessment to collective welfare, a different way of analyzing policies that's not just strictly cost benefit. I think that it prioritizes a means that is truly neutral, because cost benefit analysis has become extremely hegemonic in the realm of policy analysis, at least in the United States, in part because it seems neutral, right? You just tot up the numbers on either side of the ledger, and you get the outcome of what the best policy should be. But it's hardly neutral. It's a focus, it's inequitable. It leads to, especially in terms of the distribution of costs and benefits, it says nothing about who should bear which costs or benefits. It's highly regressive, tends to be, and it has outcomes that tend to be not just inequitable, but in the United States, at least, extremely racialized. But it is masked behind this veneer of neutrality. I think that collective cognitive capital as a metric, or at least a framework or a lens for policymaking, has actually something closer to neutrality, because again, its maximization is of the means by which we make our own decisions and have agency and freedom. It's not outcomes directed. It's not directed at getting people to make better decisions. It's directed at giving people the cognitive resources and ability to figure out what those decisions are. It steps back from where the decision should end up and figures out what is the best thing for the general welfare of the people. What does it mean for scientists? I think that this, if it were to be adopted by policymakers, which I think it should be, calls for an enormous more amount of funding, right? Good news for all of you. But I think should be a guide for interdisciplinary research that is going to have to be truly interdisciplinary, extremely networked, highly consortium-based, multimodal, multi-methodological, but that the theory itself is also helpful in generating testable hypotheses. What are the kinds of interventions that we should care about that promote, enable collective cognitive capital? It actually is, there's a way of thinking about this that says, these are the fundamental questions that we should care about. Like, how do we make the human condition better? How do we flourish? What are the components that make us flourish? And what are the societal conditions, which you can think of as interventions, experimental interventions, if you will, that make that flourish, make us flourish? I think this is going to be particularly important when we think of policy as experimentation, because where experimental research is limited. So doing a randomized controlled trial is just not particularly possible, although still very popular in some policy-making circles. But trying a policy intervention, for example, in one state or another, or a particular locality, and trying to observe, not just do people do better generally, but what do their executive functions look like? What does their brain development look like? How do those things relate to each other? Which measure do we actually need to focus on? Mechanisms, I think, are important, but maybe not strictly necessary. They can help lead to refinement. That said, I think we can get at least a good ways away down the line with this without precise causal mechanisms, but with best guesses. What is it not? What is collective cognitive capital not? I really don't want it to be individualizable. I don't want it to be a metric by which people are ranked or prioritized or evaluated. Tom has more cognitive capital than me. Perhaps he gets a better education funded by the state because that is the best, most efficient allocation of resources. That is, I think, dangerous and a slippery slope, and that I think we should have historically accurate reasons to be concerned about. I also don't think it's a complete source of values or a clear distributive metric. I think that we still have inherent dignity and intrinsic worth of human life, because there are, of course, people who do not have very much individual cognitive capital if you are in a permanent vegetative state. Or I have concerns about how this works in the context of neurodiversity, where there are different types of cognitive functioning that are non-normative, but still can be valuable depending on how much room they are given, how much support they are given, how much room they are given in the context in which they can function in society. I have some examples. I realize I'm running short on time. Maybe I'll give them to you as questions come up. But the examples run in the areas of kind of administrative burdens, what the government asks of us, the things we don't get to choose to do, like filing taxes in the United States, choosing a health insurance plan, reframing welfare, not as a handout, but as an investment, welfare or a universal basic income, framed as an investment in the collective cognitive capital of a populace, minimizing intrusions on fundamental rights, at least in the United States. Many states are restricting voting rights in ways that are cognitively demanding for people to be able to exercise a fundamental right to vote. Should the government be even allowed to do this, to spend our cognitive capital in ways that we think are damaging to the fundamental workings of our democracy? A major concern we currently have. Climate change in the environment. Environmental insults, air pollution and warming are now being shown to have effects on cognitive functioning, and not necessarily translating these into lost wages or lost productivity or GDP, but caring about this because it affects our cognitive functioning and the skills that give us the tools to lead healthy, self-determined lives. There are many risks and many problems. It's, number one, going to be very hard to build this model, put this data together. Do we need an indicator? Do we need a statistical model? Do we need a consortium, a consensus? All of those things I'm exploring. The boundaries of what constitutes a collective, which collective are we talking about, are, I think, dynamic and somewhat fuzzy. But that is not something that's unfamiliar to policymakers. I think we can deal with that. I think that there is a really strong, especially in the United States, risk of individualization and what I would consider a group to individual misuse of the kind of concept and data, which I've just talked about. And I think the biggest concern, which is a concern for any type of neuroscience and society project, is a phrase popularized by another law professor called substituting a discourse of science for a discourse of justice. And the idea that we're looking to evidence-based policy cannot solve fundamental problems about justice. What are the things we care about? What are the values and principles that cannot be determined or solved by scientific data? It just doesn't, science does not inexorably point towards a particular set of values or a particular version of justice. And we have to be careful not to make that claim that it does. I think fundamentally that collective cognitive capital could do a few things. It could help define and clarify harm when government and regulated entities directly interact with us and consume or waste our collective cognitive capital. I think it's possible that this starts to bring us into a discussion about rights, which I'm happy to expand upon further in Q&A. But fundamentally, the framework of collective cognitive capital brings brain and behavioral science into the discourse of political power. And it speaks to this existing policy discourse using the deliberate language of neoliberal capitalism, but does so as kind of a Trojan horse, a means of shifting the values away from the purported neutrality of the market to the purported neutrality of the means of human flourishing. The capacity to think, feel, socially engage, pursue goals and pleasures, and determine the course of one's own life. I think that this normative definition of what is valuable, that's brain functioning, that subserves and maximizes agency, is very closely aligned with what makes us human. And so it's what I fundamentally see as the project of governance. This is highly idealized, but I think we can get there. And I think it's the point of doing the science at the end of the day. So I hope you'll join me. And I thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to discussion.
Thank you, Emily, for, I would say, what is a profound new vision of a world that we could live in at some point in the future. I liked what you said about the Trojan horse, because so you were suggesting something that is more of an evolution rather than a revolution.
Yes.
Because if the Western world is currently dominated by, if you want, neoliberal policies and markets rather than the state of humanity, which I think we all share the view that it should be, prioritizing human well-being and happiness rather than growth of markets.
Right.
So this is a way of achieving that transition.
That's exactly it.
Without actually directly stating that the system as it is should maybe change radically. So it's I think it's a really clever way of doing it. Now, as you pointed out, how you achieve it, I don't know. So it's really, I mean, so do you think that if you want, the economists and the influencers that currently strongly, especially in the US, shape government policy, will smell a rat here and recognize this as the Trojan horse and say, thank you very much. but
thank you very much. This is progressivism disguised as science. I don't think that yes. And so I had the words Trojan horse in the paper, and then some readers were like, take that out. I don't, motivated reasoning is a powerful force in governance, especially. So I don't know whether true believers in the American conservative political project of dismantling administrative law entirely and leaving everything to, as I was saying to Troy, unbridled raw capitalism will ever be converted by this. But the moderate Democrats who have been in power or are currently in power, caveats on that, may be more persuadable. I think like the Obama administration would have really liked this. We may have more administrations like that. Maybe we're headed for a political revolution and an extremely progressive United States government, in which case, great. We can set this aside. Maybe they'll focus on human flourishing in other ways. But I think we still need to make, even if we had a revolution, we still need to make decisions about what type of human flourishing, and we still need to make resource allocation decisions. So will they smell a rat? Probably. I'm working the next set of examples, I think, needs to be focused more broadly, because I think there may be some places where a more conservative outcome is what we would get from a collective cognitive capital analysis, but I'm not sure.
Well, Emily, there's a question online.
Yeah.
Can you think of any examples of collective cognitive capital in other animal populations?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm reading a book now on collective intelligence, which is my first foray into animal populations that work very well together in collective societies, like ants and birds and flocks of birds and schools of fish that exhibit a type of collective intelligence that does inure to the benefit of the group as a whole. But I have not thought about it in terms of, so intelligence would be kind of one component of cognitive capital, but I'm not sure about more broadly than that, but it's extremely interesting.
Yeah. There's another question here. Furthering human well-being is all very nice, but how do we make sure we don't slip into paternalism while wanting the best for everybody?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that this project gets away from paternalism because, again, it focuses on, I guess, unless we define paternalism as having our brains function at their best possible mode, best possible, most capacious set of capabilities is paternalistic because that's the best thing for everybody. In which case, I cop to paternalism. But it's not, it's mean, I still think that that is means focused rather than outcome focused, because it's what people do with those capabilities that are the outcomes that are fundamentally decided by being an agent, being an instrumental agent in a particular context. So I don't know if we can ever get away from paternalism in that sense. It's like paternalism all the way down, but it's a very good question.
I was wondering, can you maybe give us a concrete example of a law or policy and how it would maybe be changed when approached with this new concept of collective cognitive capital, as opposed to with more traditional methods?
Yeah, so I think the one that I would like to see changed would be restrictions on voting rights in the United States. So voter identification laws, strong restrictions on mail-in voting or registration, enacted by states certain states, not my state, but certain states in order to, at least in name, preserve election integrity, but in practice to disenfranchise people who are already marginalized, people who have such enormous cognitive burdens from the means of daily living that they cannot also be troubled to go and get a particular type of ID, because to do that requires a huge amount of executive function, right? Like they have to figure out when a particular DMV is open and things are closed, and then they have to make an appointment, and they have to make childcare arrangements, and they have to make work arrangements, and they have to find transit and all these other things that creates this enormous burden that sounds to people who have a lot of extra cognitive capital resources. Well, if you really want to vote and if you're entitled to vote, you can figure it out. as minimizing those things. We have other states that have automatic registration. Oregon has automatic registration and widespread mail-in voting, and they have much higher rates of participation. So I would like to see voting rights laws say that the government cannot demand cognitively burdensome procedures and really recognize these as cognitive burdens without a really, really, really good reason to do so. And I think that would change, I think that touches on a fundamental right for us and it touches on the core of democratic governance. That's where I would like to see a change. I think I'd like to see changes in towards more generous cash benefits and more generous, and I would like to see a healthcare system more like yours than like ours, where we have to make all kinds of insane decisions about the type of insurance and which provider we can go to, which consumes massive amounts of cognitive capital. Also, the way we file our taxes. I am an extremely highly educated person, and it takes me hours, tens of hours every year to do this task that the government already knows all the information. Like, it's madness that there are. So a lot of it would take place in the realm of kind of administrative burden across a much of different domains.
My question's about the question of neutrality, and you mentioned it briefly. And I think it's interesting because I think science is often talked about as being very neutral and it's sort of objective. And I think it's maybe a bit of a trap society in general, and actually scientists ourselves also fall into, is believing it's a bit like a sort of truth. And then actually has massive implications when then something's wrong. And then, so I was interested how you viewed that idea as fitting into your framework, and also even this panel of experts that will have their own biases and that sort of thing.
No, it's such a good and challenging observation in the sense that science is produced by humans and is socially constructed, even though, yes, we want to think there is a truth that we are trying to discover, but the methods by which we create those truths, the incentives which people have to pursue certain questions over others, those are all socially constructed, right? They don't exist in nature as waiting to be discovered. Those are all. So how do we, your question about neutrality. I think part of the way to deal with that, and this is elaborated on more in the paper, is to explicitly bring in kind of other ways of knowing alongside a particular science domain of science. I still struggle with this. I think it's difficult for someone raised in like the Western scientific method tradition to think that there are similarly valid and valuable ways of knowing, but I'm starting to understand through different critical theory approaches that there are, and we need to incorporate those. But I think the first and only step I can give you concretely is to recognize the kind of sociology of science, that there isn't an inherent neutrality that should be privileged above all other forms, despite the fact that it's very hard for me to let go of that.
I was originally going to ask about, for example, like alcohol, which reduces cognitive function.
Sure. Yes.
So would your model say we should just like ban drugs that reduce cognitive function?
It's a great question. Right. So when I teach, because I had training as a behavioral neuroscientist in Trevor Robbins' lab, and Barry Everett's lab did a lot of addiction work. Sometimes I go out to law firms to do our continuing legal education series, where we have to, lawyers need to stay up to date on things, including an hour every couple of years of substance abuse education. And people are extremely annoyed to find out that in terms of at least brain health, alcohol is probably the worst than other substances that people might abuse. It's a really good question, because we also know that prohibition didn't work, right? So I think it would probably advocate for keeping age limits at a certain level and trying to help people reduce and moderate alcohol consumption as much as possible. But the flip side of it being the behavioral science of people are also the brains are strongly wired and incentivized to pursue both biological and social pleasures, such that strict bans and restrictions have backlash effects that are themselves detrimental. So great question though. Yeah.
More a comment than a question, I guess.
Great. Familiar with those from law.
Right. Yeah. So like, I'm just wondering, like, how, I mean, I'm very critical of all this. Like, I like the fact of, like, using science to change society, and like ultimately like knowing better on how yeah, we understand things, we know things, like, and change society. But like this sounds to me like kind of like like reframing things to change society, or framing things to change the way we perceive things, or and leave it within the realm and the bounds of law. I can't see how it like actually can change society. Like, I mean, and you're particularly probably unlucky to come here a few days after like the waivers row.
The what?
Sorry, like the abortion rights were basically cancelled.
My loss of fundamental rights in the United States.
Yeah, I mean,
that's great.
And like remaining within the bounds of law, like we see how like this hasn't changed anything for people, right? Like and the Democrats, like they could have like changed with like snap of the fingers, and then they could have stopped this, and they haven't.
Not
so
quite.
Well, okay, fine. Like, I mean, I don't know the technical details, but okay, that's my understanding. It might be wrong, but all I'm saying is like we're talking about like cognitive capital of people and so on, and like how can we talk about cognitive capital when people are struggling with their everyday life? Like, and you touched on this, right? But we're talking about like leaving all this discourse within the realm of legality, when even the most progressive governments that you mentioned, like the Obama administration, they saw the rise of Black Lives Matter movement in their own administration, right? It didn't come with Trump. And only sorry, I cut it short. Sorry. I mean, anyway, I said it was more of a comment than a question. But like ultimately, what we're seeing is like really like an intensification, an extreme intensification of class struggle, just because we have like the material condition of people are just like simply not sustainable anymore. And like we've talked about like how capital in various forms like dominate life, right? But in the end, like we are questioning, what we need to question is really like the domination of capital, as in economic capital in social relations.
That's right.
And like, I mean, talking about cognitive capital here, it sounds like to me like a little bit of a distraction. And I would like you to comment on this, but you can come back.
I think what I'm trying to do is acknowledge the extreme dominance of market fundamentalism, capitalism, and then all the things that have flowed from that in the United States: racial capitalism, class concerns, the hollowing out, the federalism decisions that have led to extreme disparities between the states in levels of social support and social support networks, especially for marginalized people. And this has been the project since before Reagan, but like really took off after Reagan. And I don't think the Obama administration was as progressive as you think it was. Yes, and obviously this all accelerated massively under Trump. And the system we have, I will admit to this being a very optimistic, future-looking solution. But I think, again, we have to put it in terms of the language of capital to be able to speak the same, to even engage with the civil servants and policymakers who are so entrenched in economic analysis that if we don't give that, if we say, actually, we're going to do a brain-based society in general, they won't understand what that means, and they won't understand how to make assessments or valuations of different policy choices. And so it might start on the margins, much like nudging has done. But I think fundamentally, this is a hopeful and optimistic thing. And that's partly what law professors are in the business of doing.
Emily,
sometimes we write for 25, 30 years from now for an entirely new court, for maybe a larger Supreme Court, because that's inhibiting a lot of progress.
Just in relation to that question, could you comment, you wanted to give an example of a UBI and how that links to the
yeah, so there's been UBI experiments, of course, all over the world, but a UBI experiment in Stockton, California, which is a city, smallish city between, in the kind of Central Valley between San Francisco and Sacramento, showed like $500 a month to unrestricted dollars a month to a relatively decent sample size in the hundreds, People did not spend the money on what conservative politicians assumed they would spend the money on. They spent very small fraction of the money on kind of vice type things, but they not only improved their material well-being, but they improved their mental and emotional and cognitive functioning as well. And so that, I don't know if that's deployable on a grand scale. These things might work better at local scales. But even if this isn't a project for the federal government, I'm working on a project in California is extremely progressive, right? In terms of our governance, truly dominated by Democrats, unlike the federal government. And California, I'm working on a project of developing a positive rights framework to say children in because state constitutions are separate from our federal constitution and much longer and more explicit. And if we said that California children have a right to healthy brain development, what does that mean in terms of state intervention? We do not have a positive rights constitution in the United States, but our constitution does not say what the government owes you. It just says what the government can't do to you, right? Very few places have positive rights constitutions, but I think our states can be, are actually going to be where this happens, not in the federal government, for all the reasons you say. The federal government, I know, dominates international discourse, but states are where people live and that affect most of our daily lives. They also have administrative agencies. I think this is where it will play out first.
I have a couple of things. First is a question about historical precedences where science, particularly cognitive science, has gotten things catastrophically wrong. Particularly when it comes to its relationship with policymaking. Okay. For example, say some humans are superior to other humans. Yeah. It's at worst creates divides and at best maintains it. Yep. So and also when you rely on scientific truth, you take a take-home message, which is not the case. For example, what we would discuss here, we would always disagree with each other, and there is not a single voice. Yeah. So how does that is going to be incorporated here? Yeah. And the second question is a practical one. Is when you say collective cognitive capital, how exactly practically it's going to be applied to people who are more diverse? Like I come from a place which is very diverse. So something that can increase cognitive load on part of a population may actually reduce in another part. For example, banning of beef. So yeah, these two questions. Thank you.
So as to your first, you remind me of the
historical.
First. Yes, the historical. So yes, as we were discussing, science, I think, does not, the use of science does not inherently prevent moral atrocities like phrenology and eugenics, right? The ranking and prioritizing of people. This has been, science has arguably been the source of some of the worst governance, collective decision making, human atrocities that we have witnessed in our recent, even our recent memorable history. How do we prevent that? Very, very firm, clear guardrails. I think that science cannot inherently by itself prevent this. This is just a risk of using science in policymaking across the board, especially when it comes to the science of human capacity, human behavior, human identity. But I don't think it's a risk that can be eliminated. So how can it be managed? If you can't eliminate risk, you have to manage it. Clear guardrails that come from other philosophical principles about distributive justice, that come from other philosophical principles about the inherent dignity and worth of all human beings, that just say, look, we can't use this for that, but it's not intrinsic to the scientific concept itself. I mean, we'd have to admit that. That would be the blurring of the discourse of science and discourse of justice. Like biological racism is still with us, is still real, but it's not science, right? Like that's not inherently science, it's science plus values. So we have to keep the constraints on the value side, and those need to be explicit. And we need to say science isn't creating the values for us. We are creating our own normative values separate. To your practical question, that's a distributive question. And I think that this doesn't currently have a good distributive theory in it, right? Because yes, what if the collective cognitive capital choices come with trade-offs? Who gets prioritized? Even if we keep it at the group level, even if we don't distill it down to the individual level. I don't know yet. I'm still working on that. I think that we may have to pull in distributive principles from other areas, but again, it's not an inherently scientific question. Those are more justice considerations. Yeah, thank you. Great question.
Hi, sorry, just one quick question. Just piggybacking on what Francesca said earlier about neutrality. But so, for example, one of the things you're suggesting, which is great, like improving cognitive function, but do we have any truly neutrally unbiased way of actually assessing what cognitive function is?
That's a great question. That's a great question. No, I think to say so, because designing any sort of test of cognitive function is inherently choices, right? It's about what types of things, what are executive functions? Which ones do we care about? There's definitional issues, but underneath that, there are values considerations. I think of a large suite of measures and kind of fighting it out in the open to figure out what are the components that make a difference, that create, and if we keep coming back to touchstones of agency, creating agency and agency to do, not just to produce economic good, but agency to engage in social relationships, to engage in raising your children, to engage in self-care issues, like the agency to organize your own time. Some of that is structural, right? Sometimes some of that's just time, which we can't control, moves linearly, but some of it is bandwidth, and some of it is cognitive capacity. And sometimes that can be bought in the market. People buy cognitive capital in the form of lawyers, accountants. I don't do my own taxes anymore because I struggled so much, right? Like I'm purchasing that. But the things that make a good life up and down the economic spectrum are enabled by executive functioning, I think, at core. And that can be developed and expanded through education. And that's, I mean, in some sense, this already exists, right? This is why we invest heavily in educating our children. Maybe it's to make them, maybe it's a form of social control, and maybe it's to make them good economic productivity units. But we think, at least ideally, that it's the foundation of a good, well-lived life outside of economic productivity, at least those of us who've been fortunate enough to be highly educated. I'm for sure you don't derive all of your life satisfaction just from the pursuits of your higher education, but it gives you a broader suite of abilities and decision-making capacities. And this is already something we value. I just think we need to make it more explicit what it is. Figure out how to measure what things we decide we care about.
Hello. To add a little bit more complexity to the question of matrix and measures, minds exist in context.
Yes.
The collective cognitive hive mind exists in, if I understood you well, in administration.
Yes.
How are you going to measure administration? Because if you don't measure your context, if you don't have a good feel of your context, any measure of your mind is totally worthless.
That's a great point. And in fact, the idea that context matters as much as mechanism is what drove me away from bench science, at least in the intellectual sense, as well as the actual rat allergy. There are scholars of public administration who actually focus, that is entirely that body of work, and draws from sociology and economics and other things that actually does measure administration and sort of governance issues and the mechanics of that. So I hope to present this at a political economy.
Can you give an example of such measures?
I'm sorry?
Can you give an example of a measure?
Yes. So one of the things is is paperwork, right? The actual amount of paperwork that people must engage with and process. And they use time measures to measure the amount of time people spend on various kind of governance, administrative activities, things like that.
Hi, thank you for the talk. So you gave a lot of examples in the context of the US and some in the UK. And I find myself a little difficult to relate to it, not because I can't care less about the US, but I think because you mentioned the word collective, I think there are perhaps other countries which are playgrounds for your theory, I think.
That would be great.
For example, like China and India, where we've already seen the labor capital of I guess, Chinese people, and Chinese people are not stupid, so I guess they have some cognitive capital to harvest. So I wonder what kind of issues your framework may address in those regimes.
Oh, it's such a good question. A question that I am going to claim no expertise or knowledge of. I'm not a comparative law scholar. And the reason this is so US centric, and I've tried to bring in tiny elements of UK, is most legal scholars in the US are really focused on, other than international law scholars and comparative law scholars do have that expertise. I don't know. But this is something that if there's something to this idea, that's exactly the direction that this needs to go into. I need to talk to comparative law scholars and scholars of public governance in other countries with other systems, because I was very focused on democratic self-governance, and that is of course not the only model of governance for successful countries. And successful is defined by world power, economics, things like that. So it's a wonderful question and something I'd love to just hear more about from people thinking about, again, early stage, that I hope means that there's resonance such that, and you said playgrounds. I love that. Thank you so much.
My question based on the previous question.
Yes.
You say a collective.
Yes.
Currently, a collective. How do you ensure that one voice does not drown the other?
Oh, it's a good question.
Currently in the US, previous social policies has meant that certain groups are already not present in the collectives that you will want around the table.
Yes.
So how do you avoid one group voice being dominant over the others that will be missing from that table, or group of people that you want around the table?
It's an extremely good question that is not unique to just this type of framework, but is at the core of kind of all political economy discussions in the US. There is the best response I can give is that there is an ascendant movement in United States legal scholarship that is responsive to kind of neoliberalism, it's calling itself law and political economy, that is focused on this critical perspective of collective power rather than individualized power. And I think is grappling specifically with those questions of within a system that is inherently a little bit or a lot hierarchical, and where people and institutions especially accumulate power, and power creates voice, how to do that. So one response is that's what voting is for, right? Like that, like every one person, one vote. But of course we know that marginalized communities don't get to vote as much, and that's exactly what needs to be remedied, but who speaks for them? A lot of foundation of this is in the more radical legal tradition in the United States, but is getting renewed emphasis and energy based truly on kind of grassroots things that are, again, in the face of losing civil rights from our Supreme Court, refocusing energy on community organizing and truly making connections, meaningful connections within an actual determined, like touching each other on a day-to-day basis community, because that is fundamentally the source of political power that's not money. And that's the only thing we can do, is to try to encourage that development. But it's a extremely important and sensitive question, because turning it all over to just experts would be more of the same. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Emily, for your wonderful lecture again, and for reminding us that we should really not be thinking of ourselves as commodity in the global market context.
That's right.
But actually that policymaking should put the human experience, the human tradition, the capital, the cognitive capital at the fore, and maybe providing a sneaky revolution in that context. So thanks for that again, and let's all thank Emily.
Thank you so much.